Hi folks, in the previous video about Bitcoin, I introduced to you the notion of stock to flow ratio, and then I made examples about cocoa, the cocoa commodity, in terms of how the available stocks of cocoa in the market and how much cocoa is being produced in a given year determines the price of which cocoa gets to be quoted in the market. Even then I mentioned about oil, which I'm going to talk about oil later, because it is relevant to the discussion of how the Bitcoin prices are purely 100% purely speculative, and they are also 100% manipulated. So if you continue with the same doctrine of stock to flow ratio, using the same example of cocoa, for instance, what happens now when you realize that in a given year that you realize that there's a certain amount of cocoa that is available, but then you realize that the only reason why there's a certain amount of cocoa that is available is because someone behind the scenes has decided to manipulate the supply of cocoa in order to drive up the prices high, which is what producers of goods tend to do in order for them to artificially manipulate prices for the goods that they produce. And a lot of this stuff is considered illegal in almost every country in the world, and it's considered collusion, and people get to go to prison for it, and sometimes they pay fines to the billions of dollars for doing it. So what happens when you learn that, oh, okay, there is a drought, but the drought is actually not naturally occurring. Someone created it, which is why there is no cocoa that's going to be produced in the next 18 months. Or what happens when you realize that someone actually bent down an entire cocoa crop that was supposed to supply half the world's population? That person would actually go to prison, not just for because even assume that the person who bent down the production was theirs, so you can't charge them for destruction of property, but you can charge them for market manipulation and for collusion, especially if they are colluding with other players in the market of cocoa to artificially increase the price of cocoa. That would generally be considered as a crime, and people will be will be will be prosecuted for it. How does that relate to oil? It relates to oil because oil since 1960 has operated, oil and gas has operated under a illegal cartel called OPEC, which every now and then manipulates the supply of oil and gas in order to benefit the members of OPEC by artificially increasing the prices of oil for their maximum profit. And because these cartel members are actually countries and the world need the oil, it's very difficult to police it and to enforce these anti-collusion laws. Therefore, it is a cartel that continues to operate, even though OPEC is an illegal organization that has operated since 1960. But they are able to artificially manipulate the price of oil because the world needs oil. There's a great enough utility for oil. So because the world needs this product that they have, they are actually able to get away with manipulating the supply in order to artificially raise the price, sometimes increasing it 50% up, 100% up, in order for them to make profits. How is that relevant to Bitcoin? It's relevant to Bitcoin because the entire argument of these Bitcoin peddlers is that Bitcoin has value because it has a fixed amount of Bitcoins that can ever be produced. Ever. And then they use this argument to try to borrow economic theory arguments to justify why Bitcoin is valuable. But now let's ask this question. Does stock to flow ratio and fixed supply doctrines also apply to supply quantities that are arbitrarily arrived at, and they are random, and no one understands or even know who has decided this amount or why this particular amount was decided upon? No? The answer is no, it doesn't apply to it. Because when there is a random or arbitrarily arrived at quantity of a commodity, which generally means manipulation of supply, people get prosecuted in regulated markets. But then Bitcoin peddlers get to say that, okay, the Bitcoin founder, who no one knows who he is, or no one wants to admit who he is, randomly, arbitrarily, unilaterally decided, without giving any rational, justifiable reason, on some fixed number of Bitcoins, of which then we need to use this randomly arrived at figure as a reason why Bitcoin cost what it costs. Does this logic follow? Because, for instance, when OPEC does it, we know that they are manipulating us for profit. And we endure it because we need their oil. But the problem with Bitcoin, they are scrambling to justify why we need Bitcoin. So they have to resort to all kinds of gimmicks and somersaults and gymnastics to explain why we need Bitcoin. And the number one argument that they have is to say Bitcoin has a fixed amount. How did you arrive to this fixed amount? How did you arrive to it? And I must say, though, that the fact that, reasonably speaking, gold does have a fixed amount of gold that is left in the world that will still be mined. That fixed amount, though, is not actually entirely fixed now, is it? Because if gold is discovered somewhere in the Congo or in South Africa or in Namibia or in Zimbabwe or in Australia, that gold will be added to the available stock. There won't be some random person deciding, no, too bad, you can't add this gold. Because it is now above this figure that we randomly and arbitrarily have arrived at. If someone somewhere in Nepal or India or China discovers some previously unknown, undiscovered, untapped, unexploited large gold deposit, that gold will be exploited and it will add to the available stock or the available flow that is going to, even if it's going to take 5 to 10 years before that mine will be ready to produce gold, but that gold will be added. So which is why I'm saying that gold, even though gold has sort of a high stock to flow ratio and can be technically considered fixed supply, it's not really fixed, because if we discover gold, that gold will be added to the stock, will be made available to the market. And more importantly, there is no one who is randomly deciding arbitrarily for non-explained and unexplainable reasons in terms of why gold should have a certain fixed amount of gold that will be made available to the market. And then based on this arbitrarily arrived at figure, then say we're going to justify saying gold now is $10,000 per ounce. If someone were to do that, we would know that we're actually being robbed blind, as the world does know that OPEC is a legal mafia. Well, they're not really legal, but they are mafia. They are robbing us blind. They are robbing the entire world. But the thing is, all of us in the world, we have this understanding that OPEC is robbing us. So in a sense, we are held hostage by them because we need the commodity that they have, but no one is under any illusion that OPEC is robbing us. That they randomly decide based on whatever price they want at a particular given moment that, okay, now the flow of oil is going to be this amount of barrels per day or per month. And then everyone has to reduce their supply. That's basically what they do. Everyone reduces their supply, and then the prices shoot up. It is different to when oil production is disturbed by conflict. And then because there's conflict in a particular area that supplies significant amounts of oil to the world, we are no longer able to exploit that oil. And then all of a sudden, overnight, immediately, the price of oil goes up, sometimes by up to 100%. That is something totally different. Unless, of course, one can show that conflict was started particularly for the very reason of making the price of oil go up. So then when someone then come and decide and says, here is a commodity or an asset class whose utility is questionable at best. It has a fixed supply who no one can explain why this amount was arrived at, and no one can explain who arrived at this amount. And no one can also explain for what reason was this fixed supply arrived at. And then they are saying that this thing, based on this entirely random, arbitrary decision to fix the amount on a certain number of coins, most of the value of this coin, which has a questionable utility, is going to cost $100,000 because of this randomly decided figure. Folks, if there's one thing for me that I pride myself of, is I pride myself to be a rational person. And I've had several conversations with devout Bitcoin adherents and devotees who are almost have this religious fervor for Bitcoin. In every single one of them, like, they can't give me any rational explanation of why this thing at some point, okay, was worth $30,000, worth $50,000, now is worth over $120,000. No one can rationally explain this to me. And then now their main argument now is the argument of stock to flow ratio, which also on its own is manipulated, it's arbitrary, it's random. And even in a normal, for instance, normal market forces situation where there's competition, when there are changes, for instance, in price of a product, especially of a product that is being supplied by a monopoly, and these changes are random and arbitrary. Oftentimes, in almost all of the countries where monopolies are legal, like maybe South Africa, the UK, or the US, such a decision can be challenged in court because that decision often hurts the customer to directly benefit the person who is manipulating the price. And so it's not just about the random changes in prices, it's also about random and arbitrary changes in supply. Because if, for instance, you were producing an X amount of goods that you are producing for a number of time, and you have market power to affect prices, you are a price setter, and then all of a sudden you adjust downwards how much you are producing of the product that you're selling, people can actually take you to court. Because part of the understanding that we have, especially when you're dealing with monopolies, is that random and arbitrary changes in supply, random and arbitrary changes in price cannot be tolerated. There has to be a rational and justifiable reason why you are changing the supply. And so when it comes to Bitcoin in particular, clouded in mystery and secrecy and all kinds of like dark and cloud like kind of situation, if you're going to justify why this commodity, which at best has questionable utility, has to be worth this amount of money, you can't be on the first instance be relying on stock to flow ratios and fixed supply when your stock to flow and fixed supply is arbitrarily arrived at and is randomly arrived at, and we don't even know who decided this amount. Who decided this amount? Why did they decide this amount? What purpose is this amount? If you're saying this, there can only be 10, I'm just making an example. If you're saying that there can only be 10 million Bitcoins in the world, why? Why 10 million? Why not 20? Why not 5? And if you can't explain to me why this figure, then you can't use that figure as a justification for the price. Does that make sense? I hope it makes sense. This is why for me I'm saying to folks, stop buying this thing. Stop buying it. This thing is going to end in tears. It's going to end in tears. This thing. It's basically playing Russian roulette. So I'm warning you. Like, at the very least, for instance, when you have arbitrarily decided supplies of oil, at the very least, the problem is that oil doesn't have any easy substitute that can be easily found. And because of that, we're actually held hostage. But now if you're telling us, oh yeah, Bitcoin has value as a store of value, there are many other substitutes that are store of value, that I can store value in and have confidence that the value will remain stored and won't be lost for another 100 years. And gold is one of them. Real estate is one of them. Like diamonds is one of them. So there are many other substitutes of value that are more reliable and more trustworthy than this thing that you can't explain to me. And every one of these substitutes, who also are subject to the same rules of demand and supply and stock to ratio and fixed supply, their stock to ratio, their stock to flow ratios, the difference is that they are not arbitrarily and randomly decided. That's the big difference. The gold stock to flow ratio is not randomly and arbitrarily decided, and it is subject to change if more gold is discovered. The diamond, platinum, other precious metals, the PGMs, for instance, their stock to flow ratio is not randomly decided. It's not random, it's not arbitrary, it's not done under some hood where no one knows who is it's market related. So it's not just that the price is market related, it's also that the changes in the flow in the market is also market related. So that it can be understandable and quantifiable and justifiable. But on the side of Bitcoin, everything is random and arbitrary. You're telling us there's a fixed amount, no one knows why this amount. Why? Why this amount? If you can't answer to me why this amount, then you can use that amount as a justification for price. Yeah. And I've said with all of these substitutes that can be a substitute for Bitcoin in terms of store of value, have better understandable stock to flow ratios, which are not random and are not arbitrarily. And if you say no, also stock Bitcoin not necessarily as a store of value but as a currency, all of these other currencies also that there are multiple of them are substitutes of Bitcoin. Even if we just assume, for instance, because in economics you have to assume things, assume that these currencies are commodities, because that also affects the pricing of a currency. So if you take it as an asset class that is a commodity, and then I apply stock to flow theory on a currency, all of these currencies also can within reasonable ease explain why it is a certain amount of dollars, or why there's a certain amount of euros, or why there's a certain amount of rand or pound sterling, which is often determined by by the underlying economic activity in those economies where that currency is being used. So that you say that if you are using the rand or the pound sterling or the euro or the dollar as a currency, and the price which is subject to change, but also is not as volatile as this thing called Bitcoin, I can reasonably explain based on the underlying economy why, for instance, a reserve bank is printing more dollars or printing more euros. I can explain why the reserve bank is maybe buying back, cutting back on the money flow, which affects the price of that currency. All of these things can be explained with relative ease, and none of it obviously is risk-free, but it's not random and it's not arbitrary. So says to say, at every level of value proposition that they say that this thing provides value at, the competition and the alternatives have better rational economic justification for why you use them instead of this thing. Does that make sense, folks? Yeah, okay. See you. And folks, this video alone should be enough for you to never buy Bitcoin. This one video, this one alone should be enough reason why you should never buy Bitcoin. Cheers, folks. Let me know what your comments are. Do you agree? Do you disagree? And putting aside the issue of agreement or disagreements, do you understand the rational and coherent flow of my argument? That's the most important thing. The rationality and the coherency of the argument. And if you're saying that my argument is irrational, incoherent, please comment below. If you say that they are illogical arguments, please comment. If you think that there are other arguments based on logical fallacies, please also comment below. I would like to hear your thoughts. Then I can respond to that later on another video. But there's nothing that I've seen, there's no argument that I've heard that has convinced me that this is a sound investment plan. It's just not, folks. It's not. Yeah, but with all being said, as I always say, this cannot be misconstrued in any point as investment advice or financial advice. Each and every one of you folks should consult a qualified and certified financial advisor for all your financial needs. This video, as all of our videos, must only be understood as for informational and entertainment purposes only. Wherever you are, whether you're in South Africa, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, or in the European Union, consult a financial advisor who is qualified and certified and licensed for all your financial needs. See you on the next one.